thank you so much, Azuraye, for joining me today. Very excited to chat about your interesting journey and how you ended up on doing regenerative farming and ended up at Yellow Barn Farm. Just got back from there. It was really an amazing experience. The first time I've ever planted a tree. And it was, I got to say, I didn't really think anything of it. But when you do it and you're in the act and you see like everybody doing it and then like how this is going to be here, like it's a pretty cool thing. It's a really cool moment. So thank you for that. But before we start, to talk about Yellow Barn Farm, like talk a little bit about your journey and how does one end up working on, regenerative farming? Because you have an interesting path, it just wasn't your intention.
Definitely not the intention. Very surprised that I ended up here, actually. Well, to back up far enough, my parents actually moved to Boulder, Colorado when I was 7 years old. I think that was like 1998. And we moved into this neighborhood right next door to this farm. And every day we would pass it and my mom would give all the horses names. And it was just kind of this magical place that was far away, but nearby and, somewhere we had never been able to access. And then one day it came up for sale and my parents just like truly felt the universe talking to them saying that they had to go over and look at this farm and their businesses were doing well. And they ended up kind of buying this place on a whim, but it was very much like Green Acres. Like they had never done anything with land. My dad was like a tile restoration contractor doing cleaning products. And my mom had lived in California doing entertainment tonight and very much like high heels.
So what year is this?
This was probably 2001 at that point.
Okay.
And just very magically, they ended up owning this 100-acre property, very much learning how to run an entire equestrian center. There were over 50 horses being boarded here at that time. And once they took over ownership, it was truly like the most magical childhood upbringing you could even imagine. We had pretty much free reign of the entire property, and I got to just hang out with my horse every day. And we did a lot of like competitive dressage, which is like that very high end horseback riding style. But mostly I just wanted to gallop through the fields, but I was mostly getting in trouble for doing things like that. But it was incredible. We had all these different kinds of animals, goats, sheep, alpacas, a tortoise, and just getting to grow up on the land, you really learn from nature. She really becomes your teacher. And over time, my sister and I grew up and kind of stopped riding and moved out to the East Coast. She was in New York and I was in Boston. And I guess right before that, I had been going to school at CU Boulder, Colorado University in Boulder, and I had been studying international affairs and Chinese and had actually lived abroad in China and was very much on a path to be completely on the other side of the whole world, learning languages, really was interested in doing some sort of cross-cultural consulting or diplomacy of some sort, and had just really found a fascination with learning about other cultures, especially through their lens and their language. And that was really what inspired me the most and had really been kind of my guiding point, my North Star for many years. And I ended up with a job in Boston out of college that was working within the US-China field. Had a few different transitions between different jobs, ended up working with some different entrepreneurs and just kind of getting my butt kicked for a while, just working really grueling work weeks for very little pay. And then I actually ended up working with one of my really good long-term friends who was like the only person I knew in Boston. And he had just bought a moving company, like right when I had moved to Boston. And he said he needed a little help in the summer months in that peak season. And I thought I was going to help him for maybe 2 weeks. Ended up getting super sucked into the company. We ended up like really building this company from about $600,000 to $1.2 million in the next 2 years, and building software that really helped operate the whole thing, training and hiring a lot of different people that could actually help us get out of being the business. And it was like the most boot camp, mind-bending experience of my life, of just like really what it meant to be an entrepreneur. And it was truly incredible. He really became a very dear mentor to me and taught me just kind of how to get out of my own way and taught me a lot of really valuable skills of just how to really look at how a business is like a living, breathing organism that is kind of contracting and expanding. And you really have to like be sensitive to it, and that it's all directly proportionate to the amount of energy and effort that you put into it. And so I really started seeing that. And like, the feedback was immediate. Like if you messed up on something, you were going to get your butt kicked like an hour later. And so, every day it was kind of like sending your team out to battle, and like you needed to know everything that was going on. Otherwise, like a couch would go through a wall.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just a really incredible experience. Very, very tough. And I was out there moving furniture, showing up at people's doors, and people would be like, "Is the other guy in the truck? Like, you're sending this little girl to come like move this heavy dresser?" And so it was just kind of battling a lot of those gender stereotypes, and really pushing myself, because the expectation for one of the guys was here, but for me it was like way up here. Like there was no margin for error. And so it really just taught me how to be a high performer, really be diligent in the way that I'm paying attention. And February 2020 hit, the pandemic hit. There was a mass exodus out of Boston where every single school just like had to move out in the course of like a weekend. And we probably moved 350 people in like 2 to 4 days. It was nuts. God. And after that, it was kind of like my entire community had left Boston, and I was really wondering, like, what am I doing here? I feel like I've kind of leveled up my skill set. There is definitely like a big reshuffling happening in the world. If you're really paying attention, you can see that like suddenly everyone just paused. COVID really made everyone like, you couldn't do anything. And it was the first time that all of us kind of got off the hamster wheel and looked around and think like, a little bit, holy crap, what is happening? Who's in charge right now? And it just kind of really flipped my world upside down, of just like really getting to observe what was really going on, and kind of the way that everything was structured in the world. And I think I just started recognizing like, wow, interesting. Kind of everything that we've ever experienced in life as humans, someone once upon a time came up with. Someone made it up and like had an idea and then made it something in reality. And I think that really started to like open my mind to what the possibilities were of just what was happening in the world, and the fact that like we could also be those innovators, that we could think of things that are maybe really ridiculously outside of the box or seemingly impossible. And around that time for me, like an idea was kind of starting to grow about, I could really go down a deep tangent on it, but I'll try to keep it pretty narrow right now. But just kind of observing the way that like the system had kind of broken down because no one really trusted each other. And what does that really mean? We used to come from these little tiny groups of people, where maybe you lived in a village or it was originally a tribe, and we had small pods of people that usually maxed out around 150 people. And, they've done a lot of research in that now for like departments and organizations or industries or military factions kind of max out around that 150 mark. And I really was like fascinated with that idea and what that might mean for us to actually rebuild trust at a local level. That kind of like starting with every single person being kind of the main character of their own story. What does it mean to actually focus on your 150, those closest relationships to you, when it doesn't even have to be by like geographic proximity? It could be, now with technology, your 150 could be all over the world, but it's the people that you trust the most, that you hold most dear, in those relationships that you want to continue to foster. And so that was kind of this guiding thread that I started following, of just like, what are like these social organisms? Like, how are teams built? Who am I? How do I define what's important to me? And then kind of as this journey was progressing, and I was still in Boston, and then I started really feeling this call to come back to Colorado. And I had really never felt that call. I was very much like, get me out of here. I never want to come back here. And, my mom and my sister were living here, kind of hunkered down because of the pandemic. And I started talking to my family about potentially coming back. And they're like, please come back. Like, we would love to have you here. We don't really know what to do with this farm. We've been trying to sell it for the last 5 years. My parents had all of the animals move off the property. We had gone through multiple buyers. And we actually had someone who was lined up and ready to sign the closing documents. And for some reason, they just completely ghosted us. And like, we were ready to really let everything go. And so when it came back, it just kind of felt like this boomerang of like, oh my God, why can we not part ourselves from this property? And I had come back in mid-July and actually thrown a pretty big event for a bunch of different investors and entrepreneurs, and really tried to pitch this as something that someone could create, health and wellness centers or whatever you've got in mind. Someone please take it off our plate. And everyone fell in love with it. And they're like, this is absolutely an incredible property. You have to do something with it. I was like, no, you have to do something with it. I can't do anything with this. And, after that event, and like everyone was so encouraging about it, but no one wanted to take it on. I really had to sit with that for a while. And then in around August, my mom had very synchronistically gotten connected to Nick and Marissa from Drylands Agroecology Research, the nonprofit that has done all of our regenerative land design now. And they created this beautiful, beautiful master plan that really showed us what we could do to bring the land back to life. And so soon after that, they were starting to go through this process. I was still in Boston wrapping up for life. I was talking to my mom about dates to move back. And she's like, I don't know what it is, but I think you need to get back here by October 15th. I'm just getting some sort of download that there's something in the air. And I was like, okay, that sounds very woo woo, but I guess I'll like make all my plans on this very arbitrary date. And I got back here on October 15th with Charles, the guy who runs the moving company. We brought 2 moving vans straight here. And 2 days later, there was a massive wildfire that came over the ridgeline within 45 minutes. And we barely had enough time to evacuate everything. We got all our little flock of chickens off the property. And like, luckily we had these 2 moving vehicles that we just piled everything into and had to evacuate. And we're off property for over a week. They wouldn't even let you get within like a mile of this entire region. And we were just watching videos of this massive wildfire coming down the ridgeline, just eating all of the houses, and our family's house was right next door. And so we had no idea if our farm had gone up in flames, if the house was gone. And when we finally were able to come back a week later, we walked on the property, and the whole property in the back area was completely singed. Everything had burned right up until this one structure, our big outdoor riding arena, that it stopped 3 feet in front of that. And the wind had changed direction and ripped it north, and it ripped it all on the backside of the property, jumped over the highway, and didn't touch a single thing in the heart of the farm where all the real burnable stuff was.
Right.
And I think after that, for all of us, it was just kind of like, oh my God, are we supposed to be here? That's a big like shock of like truly making you recognize what you have, really reminding you how fortunate you are to have something. And we just hit the ground running after that. We've truly been like sprinting nonstop since October 2020. And in that time, we have implemented probably 80% of Nick's original master plan. We have a hoop house that is now an all-season greenhouse. We've got pigs and cows and chickens in rotation. We had an indigenous foods garden that Marissa Pulaski led last season. And we have had numerous events happen in the Yellow Barn all over the property that have just really grown this community. And, you know, I'd have to say that like all of those different experiences that I had throughout my life of like studying abroad and getting my ass kicked in this moving company, all of those things actually gave me exactly what I needed to be right here in this seat at this desk in this office, running all the things, because a lot of it just came down to management and really understanding people and understanding how an ecosystem breathes, essentially. That, you know, a lot of these tenets from like land and ecology, ecological design are absolutely transferable to social design and business design. And so we just started really looking at that and like building out our systems so that they married up at every single level, that all the patterns of everything that we're looking at were able to stack on each other, and that there's multifunctionality and that people are actually really cohesively working together. So that's kind of a very long intro, but
no, it's beautiful. No, it's great. The 2 things I want to touch on is the business aspect of like walking into a situation where, you know, you just got, like you say, you just got your ass kicked, like in the city, like in this startup mode, essentially, right? Of just like every day waking up, getting stuff done, building software, like building a business, like figuring it out day to day, right? And now you come into a situation where it's quite different. You have to like create a business model out of a farm, right? And it's 21st century, right? There's a lot of different elements. Like, I guess after you sort of made the decision of, you know, settling down, like, okay, I'm going to be here, I'm going to do something, like, what were some of the, I guess, first things you had in mind of like, okay, how do we actually make this a sustainable business so we could be here, you know, as a family, generations to come? Like, how, I guess putting your business hat on and like looking at the lay of the land, pun intended, like, what were some of the first things that you thought of, like, okay, how can we make this a business, right? What can we do to make this happen? Was that difficult to look at and assess?
You know, it's so funny that that's such a good question because it's so near and dear to my heart. And I remember when I first moved back here, you know, this place had just been in shambles for the last 5 years. And I remember I was up in like the upper arena lounge, just cleaning the place and trying to put in new locks on the doors and putting Wi-Fi in. And my sister's just standing there and she's just like, I don't think this is going to work. There's just too much to do. You know,
on day 2, I don't think this is going to work.
And It was starting with something, and it was looking at like the potential that this place had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's been so different about this project is that we never really looked at it as like, we're going to do farming and that's what's going to bring in all of the money. And we're
Right.
going to like make our money off of a head of lettuce. And I think what we've always really aimed towards is like, how do we create enough resilience and diversity in the economic structure of the property so that we can do farming because we know it's the right thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
not because we're trying to make the money from that. And so I think initially it really started with a lot of brainstorming sessions. Charles and I were very used to that through the moving company with Small Hall for
Right.
very many late nights. And we just spent hours and hours just whiteboarding and thinking about what all of the things could do. And, it would seem like every single time we'd have an idea, it'd be my mom saying, no, you can't do that. We've tried that. The county won't let you do that. There's permits involved with that. You don't have the rights to do that. And I'm like, what can we do? You can't do anything on this property. And so it was just a lot of like, all right, trial and error. I put together the whole website initially. We put together the Instagram, and we started hosting small.
Great site.
Thank you. Small events was a big piece of it. Of just like get people out to the land, even if there's nothing here right now, just show them what it's like to be on land. And so we came up with this whole idea called the Farm Hop and Farm Fest, where kind of like a bar hop where you were going from farm to farm. And we would bring people out and we would just do big tours. And then we'd have like a big open air market and we'd have live music and food. And then I think the big thing we did next was the first tree planting. We planted 3,500 trees in the course of 2 days. And I was literally just running around all of Boulder, handing out flyers, talking to literally every single human, like, please come out here, check out what we're doing, come plant a tree. There's free lunches, come hang out. And that was huge. I think that kind of like put us on the map for people recognizing, oh, wow, this old equestrian center now is actually coming back to life. And so the business model has really been, if you have the entire supply chain, which we realized was incredibly fragile after COVID, everything has expanded to such a ridiculous length that there are so many pieces in between where your food is produced to actually your dinner table. And that as things are shifting and we recognize the fragility of those systems, we saw that, what if we shrunk down the entire supply chain and we brought it back down to a local level and we decentralized it? We have a central location, a land-based location, but what if we decentralize all of the different aspects of the supply chain? So now, 3 years later, it's been like this very long journey of just like finding people, seeing what the puzzle pieces that they have, slotting them in, seeing if they work in that location, that range. And I just kind of came up with all the different kinds of agreements to get people to function together and really understanding like the numbers and putting those systems into place. And so now, a beautiful example of what this looks like is, the Olive Egg. They are the chicken operation on the entire property, and they own that piece of the supply chain. This woman who runs the operation, she knows everything there is to know about chickens. And so she's the one that's been breeding them for years. She understands how to process them. They're now in rotational grazing patterns going through the silvopastures that Dar designed and implemented. And because she can hold that piece specifically, it means that like the farm itself doesn't have to like hold everything that's operating here. We can be the people that are interweaving between and kind of like sewing together the different pieces so that they can operate holistically. And there's a bunch of different little entities that we have operating here. There's a landscaping company that also has a nonprofit that does educational gardening. There's a guy who has these take-home garden kits that have like a subterranean watering mechanism that you put a bunch of different amendments in and you get like 3x the yield. There's a girl who has a compost tea and steam weeding business. And there is a van conversion company that does like all of our construction and building on the property and has also built vehicles for us. That like we've got a handyman van now, which is literally like an entire workshop inside of a van.
Yeah.
And we have the Stalk market, which is like corn stock, which is this amazing, beautiful little shipping container that is a little grocery store inside. And we have Threshold Collective that does all of these beautiful regenerative events. So health and wellness, that's really focused on regenerative farming communities. So that's yoga and wellness and all of these beautiful things. And then DAR, obviously, Drylands Agroecology Research does all of kind of like the holistic land design and implementation and a lot of the farming, a lot of the programming here. And then we have a lot of educational programming for young kids and adults. And a lot of it's like the vision's always been, how can this be summer camp all year for every age group. All of us want to play. We all want to go back to that. And we also want to have an impact. And it would be amazing if all of these different trades and skills and things that are actually useful, you were learning because there was a need for those things to actually happen on the farm anyway. But you also got to try your hand in a wide variety of different things to see what really resonated with you. And my fascination in all of this has been, how do we change this model from, the stereotypical, there is a slot that needs to be filled and we're just going to fit the most qualified person in with that. Instead, we really say, okay, here are all the things that need to get done. Who's available and interested and really inspired by what we're doing at the ethos level? And then what are their unique gifts? What are their skill sets? What are their talents? And how can we pick out from all the different things that need to happen and craft a role around this person so that they can truly be in their zone of genius? Because when they're in their zone of genius, you're not going to spend nearly as much time micromanaging someone because they've already set that standard for themselves. They really, really care and they want to see whatever they're doing truly come to fruition and be done in the right way. And so now our role is mostly just being like the guardrails, the guiding force of saying, okay, does this work for you? Are you getting compensated? Can we actually craft a role where we know that there's economic inflow coming from these entities, but maybe over here where you're super passionate, you might just have to volunteer. So how do we create something that actually finds equilibrium where you have enough time to take care of yourself, do the things that really inspire you and charge you up, and you're also getting the necessities done that also get you paid and pay the bills?
Yeah. I mean, I love how you're allowing other people to interact with the land as well. Like whether it's a business, whether it's there to volunteer, whether it's there to come to an event. I love the idea of sort of having these little areas of the land where there's like a specialty that goes into it because, hey, like there's the chicken area, right? We have this here as an asset. Let's use it. Let's find somebody who can, get to its full potential, right? Because you can't do everything, right? You can't run everything on the entire property, but to have people come in and use it, almost like have them build their little business themselves, right? Or their little dream on the land. And, they don't own property, right? They don't own, it's like renting a little office space a little bit. It's almost like a co-working spot.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly how we framed it.
Yeah. So, but it's outdoors, right? It's we usually think WeWork's inside and office spaces is outwork, right? It's this sort of aspect of co-working outdoors and using the land in a variety of different ways because it has so much to offer. The next thing I wanted to touch on was like regenerative farming and like how were you first introduced to it? Like what was the learning curve like? Like were you even aware of it, right? When you bought the land, came and then did they just knock on the door and say, hey, we're DAR? Or did you reach out and say, hey, we want to incorporate regenerative farming practices here? I guess just talk about your relationship with that because it's starting to get a little momentum where I think people are realizing, especially where it's, your own property, your own land, it can work for you in so many positive ways. But I guess talk about your introduction into that.
Well, I think I was really fortunate growing up here. I got to go to a Waldorf school. And if you've heard of Rudolf Steiner, he really came up with these ideas around biodynamic farming. And what it really meant to be in relationship with the land. And I mean, these practices are very, very ancient. Don't get me wrong.
They're the original practice.
Very much comes from. Exactly. And indigenous cultures have farmed this way for centuries. I mean, this is really like our connection with the land and what you put into your body. And I think, for me growing up in this little Boulder bubble, really, and getting to be on land, a lot of it was about, my mom had a little biodynamic CSA garden. And so I was very much in that world. And my dad was insanely health conscious. When I was 14, I didn't get the sex talk. I got the sugar talk. And it was more of this is the impact of sugar on your body. And, it really blew my mind. And I went through a big phase where I was very much eating all the crap that was available out there once I was on my own. And I think it's been very much a full circle of coming back and recognizing what am I putting into my body? How do I want to live in relationship to the world around me? And I think there's a lot of us that feel this very deep calling to come back to land, to really reestablish that relationship that I think is very, very deep in our DNA, that we want to be connected with nature because we are of nature. And so getting back into a relationship with your food is kind of that first portal that you can step through to do that. And so I had very much grown up in a world that was aware of food and the way that we do farming. And I had studied a lot of that anyway and had been able to grow up on land. And so my introduction to this actually came through a good friend of mine recommending this movie called Kiss the Ground.
Mm.
And you may have heard of that, but it talks really a lot about what regenerative farming looks like, carbon sequestration, and
Yep.
really the whole aspect, the kind of the tagline of that entire film was that the quickest way to not just fight climate change, but reverse it was to do regenerative farming, was to take
Mm.
care of the soil. The
Yeah.
answer was in the soil.
Yep.
And so I saw that movie and I called my mom immediately and I was like, you've got to watch this film. It's talking about everything we've always been dreaming about. And she saw it and she's like, that's crazy that you just said that, because I literally just got connected to these regenerative land designers that are like 7 minutes down the road. And they've got their whole little demonstration property called Elk Run. They're really interested in working with us and doing it like on a larger scale here. And so, from there, I came back and started spending a lot of time with Nick and Marissa. We would pretty much just like whiteboard late into the night, just talking about like, what are they doing? What are like my skill sets? Who are we? Why are we all here? How did this all very synchronistically happen at the same time? And from that, I will never forget just like something that Nick was really explaining to me is that when he starts looking at a piece of land of like, what does it want to be? How does like the water move? How does nature really want to show itself? And how do we facilitate that? And that every single piece of land is not the last. There's always differentiation. And so we can look at like the high level patterns, and then you can get down to the details at the micro level. And everything he was saying about regenerative land design was just hitting my brain. And like, I have seen that in business design. I have seen that in people systems.
Yeah.
Everything that you're saying to me already has context in my brain from all of my other experiences. And so for me, the learning curve was actually pretty smooth. I just like could piece everything together and overlay it on a lot of information that I already had. And the concepts just made a lot of sense. Of course, you want to bring the soil back to life. How do you do that? You work with nature. You don't control it. You don't use pesticides and herbicides, because that's just trying to dominate something versus actually working with it. And nature's constantly moving and adapting and changing. Whatever pesticides you used a year ago, nature will adapt and learn how to overcome that or shift around it.
Yeah.
So will all the pests with it. So it's just a losing battle in the long run. And so, so much of this was just like spending time with them and getting immersed in it, and then just learning all the names. I had to memorize all the different plants that we were planting out in the silvopasture because I was talking to everyone about like, come plant all these trees. And they're like, well, what kind of trees? And I was like, oh my God, I got to memorize this entire list. But it made a lot of sense. And like, yeah, by the way, it's apple, pear, plum, mulberry, hackberry, serviceberry, gooseberry, false indigo, and Siberian pea shrub.
You have memorized it successfully.
Yeah. And so it was just like, how do you explain this to someone who doesn't have any context for farming? How do you give them some level of understanding just at the basic level? And usually how I approach that is talking about things that we're very, very familiar with. You're very familiar with yourself. That's like probably number one. You are your own favorite hobby. You're probably the thing that you spend the most time thinking about and observing and interacting with. And so I just really started looking at these concepts of like, okay, we're talking about soil, but most people have probably not even put their hands in the soil, sadly. They don't understand what that means. They don't understand about the microbiology and how all these things interact with each other. But the way that I started really thinking about this is like, okay, when we deal with human relationships, we're also essentially farming, we're gardening, we are tending to soil. Once you have communication between two entities and they're talking to each other, you're starting to establish that this is the development of social soil. We're starting to build it. We're starting to recognize what is the lay of the land. You might have relationships that are dry and degraded and barren. Yeah. It's just a wasteland.
Yeah. Need some love.
Or they're exactly. And maybe there are other ones that like you really nurtured and you put a lot of energy into, and it's this beautiful blooming garden. And really, I started seeing how this relationship of like your 150 relationships is kind of like the whole garden that you're tending to. And the further out, I kind of think of it as a spiral going outward from yourself. The further out it goes, there's still people that are in your garden, but they're the relationships that maybe, it's not degrading. It's just further away. It's stuff that you're not really tending to as much. And that the relationships that are closest to you, in permaculture design, they call that zone zero. That's like home base. That is like where all the main activity happens. It's where you put the home. It's maybe you've got a few chickens and like your herb gardens that you're going to be pulling in for your cooking day to day. It's where the primary activity happens. And that's the same with our social groups. Like if you are your primary entity and you're taking care of your own home base and your own garden, that next person to you, whether that is a partner or a best friend or whatever that might look like for you, that's probably the relationship you're tending to most. You're putting the most energy into it. And it can either be a really positive relationship where there's a lot of abundance and it feeds both of you, or it could be a really draining relationship. And I think a lot of us are kind of recognizing like what is toxicity, what is like a dry, degraded, depleted landscape in a social setting. So how do we want to tend the relationships around us? How do we want to revitalize them so that they feed all of the people that are a part of that relationship group?
Amazing. I want to kind of end on a little bit of the future. And, I know there's a lot of moving parts when dealing with land and dealing with being a business as well. There's going to be so many variables that go into week to week, day to day, month to month. But when you look at like almost 3 years now, I guess you sort of, been back day to day, like figuring this thing out. What does the next sort of 3 to 5 years look like? Like what's on, your whiteboard right now, trying to figure out, the future, and as you move with the land, building new things, creating new partnerships, having the events, having the stock market, the little grocery, like there's a lot of these parts that are foundationally sort of there now. And now it's like looking at, okay, how do we scale as much as we can, right? Being a physical land location, it's very different than like software or a moving company, right? There's a little bit of a difference there. But like, how do you look at the future, and what are some of the successes and goals that you would like to achieve?
Yeah, I think right out the gate, we really started with this idea that this is a demonstration. It's a demonstration for what it all could look like. And that by bringing all these different organizations and demonstrating what all of the different systems could be, the hope is that once we max out on our capacity, we have a whole compost and food delivery program, and we've got the moving company that still operates here so they can share the vehicles and all of these synergies that are now growing. What we found is that all of these little tiny businesses that are operating, eventually those people will be able to manage a second location and then a third and a fourth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that what we're seeing is more of like a horizontal growth instead of it being a vertical growth where we own everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're not trying to expand Yellow Barn across the globe. It's actually expanding the model itself. And so that as we start to hit capacity about what we can realistically and economically service, because we know there's a certain service radius that we can go out to before we start kind of losing money on that. And so what we're already starting to see is like as demand starts peaking in certain locations and it's right outside of our service area, we can do that right now, but it's not very economical. But the goal is to make those routes tighter and tighter so that we have a really dedicated community that we know consistently, this is how many pigs we need each year. This is how many cows we need. This is how many chickens, because this gives us a predictability in our local marketplace because we're feeding a certain number of families. That number is roughly around 150 households. Wow. So roughly about 300 people.
Wow.
And once we hit that capacity, then the goal is actually to take the model and take it to another location. Because this can only move by geographic hubs. And so, the next location could be in downtown Boulder, and there's already a farm, and I'm already thinking it would be like a perfect location. And we just ask them, what kind of systems do you need? Do you want someone to come in and run all of your chicken operations? Would you like a little shipping container grocery store? Would that work for your community? And so I think as we become like more knowledgeable in what this systems design looks like, we can approach them and say, let us help you assess what you need and let's get it implemented and up and running, and then train your people to manage those systems. And so maybe we have like a manager that's an expert in the chicken operation and they're managing 3 or 4 different locations, but you actually have the on the farm labor, those people that are there, they understand what's actually happening on the day to day running these systems. And so now you're creating economic diversity so that they can actually have additional income streams that don't just rely on the head of lettuce. Yep. So that way, if you get a bad crop, you're not totally out and you can't pay your labor. You've got the egg business that's cranking and people are always going to want eggs. And so we just consistently are looking like, how can we diversify out all of the revenue streams to make this more resilient and copying what nature does? And then create this as like an a la carte menu that someone could come here and say, gosh, I love the fact that you've got these little grow kits, or the fact that there's a compost tea business. And all of these businesses eventually will want to be able to expand to different locations. And we're just kind of setting up the basic infrastructure so that they can do that. And it's a beautiful win-win for the land-based partners and these smaller entities that are coming in.
How long do you think that would be before you kind of have that? Because going back to what you said before, you always thought you'd be like maybe like a consultant of some sort and have like that type of thing. And this is you're kind of putting that hat back on potentially getting the workflow, getting the efficiency, getting the blueprint down, the yellow barn farm blueprint. And then you can kind of go and systematically implement that in these little, communities, whether it's like you said, 150, 300 people. Like there's communities like this everywhere, right? Not just even in Colorado, but like tons and tons of areas in the US. So that seems to be like a really cool idea. Like how far along you think you are where you feel comfortable, delivering that, like having that official like blueprint, right? That you can kind of go and say, hey, let's do this at a second place.
And it's so funny. It's because people used to ask me in college, like, what are you going to do when you graduate? I have no idea. I'm going to make up something that sounds cool. And I came up with an international business consultant. I was like, I don't know anything about business. I'm never going to be able to do something like that. But here I've kind of found myself weirdly full circle coming into that. And I think that that's actually ultimately the dream, is really like with all of us, Nick and Marissa from DAR and Charles with Small Hall. And we have these leads that are really becoming experts in a specific area. And what I love about this is like, it's not such a narrow niche of focus where I think like a lot of our education has kind of pigeonholed people into only knowing one topic extremely well, but it means that they're siloed because they're not actually looking at the patterns across multiple disciplines. Whereas I think this is like really forced all of us to really look at everything holistically. And my lens of that has really been people, and people are all over the world. And I think the goal will ultimately be to, work with businesses and people and these groups in multiple different countries, and ideally in multiple languages. And like all of the framework is very, very similar, because when you get down to it, people are very similar in a lot of ways, but we've got a lot of differentiation in culture, the same way that we do with climate and land. You can come in from like Boulder, or Colorado, which is very dry and tends to be quite barren and drought ridden, and then go to somewhere like Costa Rica, and the patterns are still there. We're still dealing with soil and trees and animals. They're just different patterning. And so I think the same can be applied to people and businesses. And so, I think it's within, the next 2 to 3 years. I think we're already to get a lot of interest from other parties that are asking all of us to, come out to Tanzania or come to California or come to Costa Rica. And we're like, God, we want to, but we have to get this one down. We have to actually prove that this whole thing works. And thus far it has been working, but it's not at the point where I feel like, cool, we've hit equilibrium. I have known that our horizon is about a 7-year game plan, because it takes about 7 years on average for any ecosystem to reach a point of equilibrium. And while we might be able to branch out well before that, it's like that will be the point where there is consistency and the patterns are recognized and people are stable, and it's really grown to what it needs to ultimately be a full-fledged demonstration.
Wow. Azuraye, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation. Like I learned so much, and just visiting the land and the farm, like it was a truly unique space, having so many people there from the community, like people engaging with the lands, like music, like markets, like there's something for everybody. And it's just like, wow, like this is like what it's all about. Like building something like this for so many people to interact with, I think is just like, man, it's like something we all, I think, attain to in some ways, is building something where we have a true community of people like interacting with each other, helping each other, being there for each other, right? Because like you said, I mean, things could happen, whether it's happen to the world or happen in a local community. I mean, look, just like the brush fires you said, I mean, that affects, it could affect your entire life and your entire family's life and generations. Like if you have to move and go somewhere, like, so like to have that tight knit community, like there physically, we live in this digital world, right? It's cool too, but that physical relationship is still so special when you see it like in person, you interact with it, like there's a feeling there, right? You do feel something. Appreciate you taking the time, and like best of luck for the next decade.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate the conversation. It was fun.